The day I realized I meant nothing to them was the day I heard my boss laughing outside the restroom. "She's just duct tape holding old systems together," he joked while someone on speakerphone laughed with him. I stepped out of the restroom quietly and walked past him without a word. But inside me, something snapped so cleanly it felt like a wire finally breaking after years of pressure. My name was Sandra Kim, and I had spent nearly 10 years at Valence Systems. I wasn't flashy or loud, but every crisis, every outage, every disaster somehow ended on my desk. I rebuilt systems no one appreciated and fixed failures no one else understood. The company only remembered my existence when something exploded 5 minutes before a deadline. 3 years earlier, I had quietly inserted myself into the company's escrow security protocol, not for revenge, but because I knew someday someone careless would try to destroy what they didn't understand. The company founder's son-in-law, Brandon Cole, arrived with expensive suits and fake confidence. He spoke in buzzwords, smiled for executives, and acted like experience was outdated furniture. Within his first week, Brandon began slashing budgets and reviewing legacy positions. People like me suddenly became numbers inside spreadsheets instead of human beings. He called me cost center Sandra behind my back and mocked compliance work openly. To him, systems only mattered if they looked impressive on presentation slides. I watched him ignore critical infrastructure documents during meetings. When he saw the escrow protocol, he dismissed it as old corporate nonsense. That clause protected the company's entire source code in case of disaster or hostile takeover. Brandon skipped past it like a child, skipping warning labels on explosives. The founder, Ron Mercer, still trusted me, but lately he stayed silent during meetings. He let Brandon bulldoze departments while pretending everything was under control. Every day became exhausting corporate theater filled with fake positivity and meaningless slogans. Meanwhile, I quietly kept the company alive from the shadows. Then came the quarterly town hall that changed everything forever. Brandon stood proudly on stage talking about speed, innovation, and aggressive scaling. He announced impossible deadlines and ignored every compliance safeguard we had built. It sounded less like strategy and more like driving blindfolded toward a cliff. I calmly asked one question in front of everyone. What happens if deployment fails and rollback systems don't activate? The room went silent as Brandon stared at me with irritation. Then, without hesitation, he muted my microphone in front of the entire company. "Let's focus on solutions, not negativity," he said smugly while continuing the presentation. 80 employees watched me disappear from the conversation with one click. After the meeting, Brandon messaged me privately with thinly disguised threats. He warned me about attitude, alignment, and upcoming organizational changes. I answered with only 3 words. "Copy that, noted." Later that day, HR invited me to a cheerful little check-in meeting. The smiling HR manager suggested my energy was harming workplace morale. She spoke carefully, like someone trying to gaslight me with polite vocabulary. Apparently, asking realistic questions during meetings now counted as negativity. I didn't argue or defend myself because I already understood what was happening. They were preparing to remove me quietly and publicly blame me for it. That night, I reopened Clause 17C inside the escrow agreement. The document stared back at me like a loaded weapon waiting patiently in a drawer. The clause stated that removing the designated escrow validator without legal review would trigger an automatic lockdown. No code access, no deployment rights, no system restoration for 72 hours, and I was the designated validator. The company's entire emergency infrastructure revolved around my authorization token. A week later, Brandon scheduled another company-wide meeting labeled Strategic Realignment. Everyone already knew what those words really meant. Brandon smiled into the camera and announced my role was being optimized out. No private conversation, no warning, no respect, just public humiliation disguised as leadership. While muted on camera, I slowly held up my employee badge. Then I tilted it carefully until the escrow validation hologram reflected under the light. Several engineers instantly froze when they recognized the symbol. Legal staff suddenly began messaging each other in panic behind the scenes. I logged out of the meeting without saying a single word. 15 minutes later, the first alarms inside the company started screaming. Legal departments flooded Slack channels asking if Brandon had terminated the escrow validator without review. The CTO reportedly went pale the moment he understood what had happened. Then the automated lockdown activated exactly as designed. Code pushes failed, rollback systems froze, and infrastructure access vanished across the company. Every screen displayed the same terrifying message. Escrow release condition triggered awaiting external compliance authorization. Clients immediately noticed outages and began demanding answers. Support teams panicked while investors demanded emergency explanations. Meanwhile, I sat quietly at home eating strawberries and watching old sitcom reruns. For the first time in years, my phone buzzed nonstop while I ignored every call. Brandon sent desperate messages pretending we could simply move past misunderstandings. He suddenly needed the same employee he had publicly erased. I never replied because this was no longer about emotions or revenge. This was about consequences finally arriving on time. Investor lawyers soon joined emergency meetings and immediately recognized the severity of the situation. One attorney bluntly called Brandon's actions a contractual disaster. The founder finally exploded after learning the entire security system depended on my authorization. "You fired the architect who built the safety system," Ron said coldly. By that evening, Brandon had lost all authority inside the company. Executives avoided eye contact with him like he carried an infection. The next morning, investors contacted me directly with a new proposal. Not as an employee, but as independent oversight authority with full compliance control. I negotiated carefully and demanded complete autonomy over escrow systems and audits. No executive would ever again silence or override me. They agreed to every single condition without hesitation. Suddenly, the woman they called legacy overhead became the company's most protected asset. When I returned to headquarters, security handed me a brand new badge marked external oversight. I no longer belonged beneath management because now management answered to me. Brandon's office stood completely empty except for abandoned protein shakes and useless strategy notes. His entire empire of buzzwords had collapsed in less than 72 hours. During the emergency board meeting, Ron asked me to explain Clause 17C personally. I described the protocol calmly while Brandon sat silently, unable to defend himself anymore. Then I finalized the restoration authorization and officially removed Brandon from operational authority. The room stayed silent because everyone finally understood who had truly built the company's foundations. And that was the moment they learned the quietest people in the room are often the most dangerous to underestimate. Please subscribe and share our channel. We make videos for you and bring more powerful stories every day. Weeks later, the company slowly recovered, but the atmosphere inside Valent Systems had completely changed. People no longer laughed during compliance meetings and nobody ignored infrastructure warnings anymore. Ron personally restored every quarterly security review that Brandon had canceled. For the first time in years, the company started respecting the systems that quietly kept them alive. Employees who once stayed silent during my humiliation now greeted me carefully in hallways. Not because they feared me, but because they finally understood the cost of disrespecting the wrong person. Brandon's removal became an unspoken lesson whispered through every department in the building. New managers were warned never to touch systems they didn't fully understand. As for me, I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who only valued noise and titles. I had already proven everything the moment the entire company froze without my permission. The biggest irony was simple. The woman they called replaceable became the one person the company could never afford to lose again. And if this story taught them anything, it was this. Never underestimate the quiet person holding the foundation together while everyone else chases applause.